Good morning, everyone. What I'm going to present today is a project which I think is very much in the spirit of what this center is about, because it's actually a project where what we try to do is to put together evidence on the current stage of the literature and the analysis that has been done so far on the economics of human development and social mobility. It's a project that turned into an article which will be published in the Annual Reviews of Economics on which I worked on with Professor Heckman. And what we find in this project is first some main lessons, which I think is important to present at first, which is that, as Flavio was already pointing out, at least 50% of the inequality, many studies find even more, is determined by age 18 and by factors that are present when the person basically enters college. The reason of that fact is that skills are indeed the major determinant of this type of inequality. And as skills are formed largely during the years before age 18, that's what determines this high importance. So even if we think about all the macroeconomic uncertainty, whatever can happen to a person during his life, actually we still see that the heterogeneity in the starting point, so when people make their schooling decision, for example, for going to college or not, is determinant of at least 50% of their inequality in earnings, for example. And a third point is that early intervention seems to be more effective than adolescence. It doesn't mean that there cannot be an effective adolescent intervention, but it means that on average it seems that indeed in the early years skills are more malleable than they are later on, and therefore it's more efficient to focus on the early years. And the last key lessons, which I think is something that really comes out once a person starts to analyzing all those programs and all those studies that have analyzed those different type of interventions or other type of policies, is that really the policies that are effective are the policies that are able to engage the whole family. So not only the policies that intervene on the child, but also the policies that in some way are able to, for example, influence the information that the parents have. If it's through a direct intervention or even indirectly, just by, for example, having the parents being at the center where the child is receiving treatment for once a week, for example, for some activities. So the factors are probably established, and that were already mentioned by both Professor Heckman and Flavio before, are the importance of multiple skills, not only focusing on IQ, and important therefore to measure, also have measures in order to assess the importance of these other skills. The fact that the gaps, as the graph you were showing on the word count, on word knowledge, are present since the early years, that skills are malleable in different ways, in different periods of development. So there are like critical and sensitive periods in which is more important to focus on investment if one wants to have them effective. And related with what we were saying before on the evidence of the intervention, that indeed family seems to be, not only for word development, but for general development, the major determinant of how children turns out to be. Just to give you an example from another piece of research I've been working on also with Professor Heckman and Philip Heisenauer, is the importance of skills in this case for schooling outcomes. And as you see, this is college entrance, so enrollment in college, and the left graphs plots the probability of entering in college, whereas the right one plots the net return, so the return taking into account the monetary and what has been called the psychic cost of college. And as you can see, like both in terms of cognitive, which is this axis, and non-cognitive skills, both the probability of enrolling in college and the actual returns that people get from being in college, it's very much affected by not only the cognitive dimension, but also the non-cognitive dimension. And you can see both, if you take a slice, even at low level of cognitive skills, the non-cognitive skills have a role, but the thing is true over the whole distribution. And what you see actually is that, for example, when you look at net returns, they are not even positive everywhere. So there are actually large part of the population, if you enter college, and this is obviously it doesn't mean that these people ends up entering college. It's an experiment that we do through the model of seeing what would be the return at these people enrolled into college given the skills that they have. And as you can see, well, here, the return is actually below zero for a large proportion of people that are lacking those skills. So the framework that we've used in the review, and I think that is not only has been awarded prizes for its importance, but it's really also useful in terms of analyzing and putting together different pieces of information on the role of the family, the role of interventions, the role of other types of programs, is the technology of skill formation, which I present here in a very summarized form. What the technology of skill formation basically is simply a map between inputs and outputs, where output is the level of skills of the child it's a dynamic technology, so let's think about the level of the human capital of the child next period, and the input are the current level of the child, which if we start from period 0 would be his genetic endowments, and then however he evolves from that. The inputs he receives from the parents or from other mentors, teachers, whoever he interacts with, in terms of time investments, time spent with him, for example, talking to him, and good investments in terms of the access he has, for example, in terms of books he can read, etc. It's important to notice that there is a role for parental skills, and probably we should extend this in considering like not only parental skills, but let's say parental characteristics in more general, which interacts with the effectiveness that the investment will have. I always mention the extreme example of a parent who is not very able to read. Is likely that reading to the child is not a very effective investment for the parent. It's clearly an extreme example, but we can think at the more many realistic situations in which indeed the parents select investments which depends also on his capacity to actually provide them. And the last aspect, the other inputs are whatever the child is faced with. So it could be an intervention. It could be simply interacting with the teacher in kindergarten or with the environment of other family members. And the important implications of this technology, I think actually we're discovering more and more important aspects of this technology and of the empirical estimates of this technology every time one looks at it, because one is what I was saying, the crucial role of parental skills that are this equalizing force even for equal investment. Take my, again, extreme example of the difficulty in reading. The number of books in this case is kind of irrelevant by itself, is no one, unless you can read them by yourself, if no one reads them to you. The other aspect that was very much emphasized already in the literature is the aspect of dynamic complementarity, which is basically what motivates the fact that early intervention are more effective than late interventions, and is the fact that the earlier you create a skill base, the greater the skill base and the more effective future investment will be in producing new skills. So this complementarity between the investment that you have at the current period and the investment that you will do tomorrow, the productivity will be increased. And another aspect which I think was kind of overlooked in the literature, but is actually crucial to many of the results that the literature itself was showing, is that if skills an investment, so if the current level of human capital of the child and the investment he receives are complementary, and we know that, and if you're better in terms of, at least we know it from the empirical estimates, that children that have a higher level of human capital absorb more, and it's intuitively also makes sense, absorb more the investment that a teacher or a parent does towards them. But the important aspect is actually not only the presence of this complementarity, but the fact that this is increasing over stages of development. And emphasizing this aspect is actually important because it's what gives us an efficient reason, a point that Professor Ekman stresses very often, an efficient reason to invest more in the disadvantaged children. So even absent any fairness consideration, which might increase our propensity to invest more in the disadvantaged for some social justice reason, but even absent that incentive to do it, it's actually efficient even for a planner that is only concerned in maximizing, say, human capital in the population to do so. And you see it in this graph, which is from a simulation that we did in a simple model, where you see this dashed line represent the investment in the first stage. This is a two-stage technology, what we are simulating in the first stage as a function of the complementarity or substitutability, this rho 1 parameter in between skills and an investment, and you see that a complementarity is increasing in this direction. So the more complementary they are, and in this case, not only the more complementary they are in the first period, but the more equal complementarity is in the first and in the second period, which is this area of the graph here, the more is actually efficient to invest in the advantaged children, and you would invest more in the advantaged one than in the disadvantaged one. But the more the first period technology skills and investment becomes substitutable, keeping fixed whatever happened in the second period, you see that investing in the disadvantaged children becomes more profitable, and actually the level of early investment in the disadvantaged child will be higher. In this case, if there are 2 children, it will be higher than the level of investment in the advantaged children. And there is no fairness consideration here. We're just maximizing final human capital at the end of stage 2. The literature has gone beyond the model of the technology, as you have seen, in terms of this dynamic equation of our dynamic factor model, where the human capital of the child is this unobserved latent variable. And people have looked into it, trying to explain what actually determines parental investment. So one example is what Flavio was mentioning, but one is what I was mentioning, the aspect of parental abilities, but there is actually a lot of literature that even conditioning on that, like what is the role of income, what is the role of financial constraints, or what is the role of information. What is the role of the altruism that parents, how much parents actually want to invest, so in this case parental preferences, how much parents wants to invest in their children. Parents might be heterogeneous on these aspects. And the important thing in this literature is actually to try to focus, and what we emphasize in the paper, in what are we think are the important margin of choice, which are often neglected. For example, one aspect is time. Only recently the literature started looking at time investments, obviously finding that it has a huge impact on child development. And the important thing of looking at times, it's, as well as good allocation, but especially time, is that it interacts with many other life cycle decisions, such as labor supply decision. And we might think that these, not only it interacts, but is affected by many policies that, if we think just, for example, at the change in wages, these will affect the time that you spend with your child as well, because it changes your leisure work balance, and therefore the time that you have to spend at home. The other aspect is something I'm working on right now, which is the interaction between those aspects and the timing of fertility. Very often those models assume that fertility is an exogenous process. On the contrary, we think that families don't have children randomly, but they try to, at least as much as it is possible, to plan the moment in which they have their children, and this interacts actually with the financial constraints they might face. If I know I want to provide enough to my child, but I cannot do it in the current period, an option is not only having a child and not providing enough, but is also wait until I will be in a situation in which I will be able to provide more. And the other aspect is intra-family allocation across multiple children, which is also an aspect that is often neglected because it's complex to do it, but it's very important because it can actually help us understand in relating it to what I was saying before. For example, do families do, for example, what is efficient? So do they tend to invest more whenever it seems to be efficient to do so in the disadvantage of the 2 children? Or do they overdo that? So is there a concern for equality, for fairness in families? Or actually, do they not respond to those incentives and invest in a way that is not neither efficient nor fair? We use this framework of the technology in order to analyze 2 aspects. We analyze more in the paper, but I focus on 2 aspects here. One is a general lesson on the main messages that we get from the literature on analyzing interventions, and the other, by intervention I mean programs where the child is actually in a center, for example, is engaged somehow. And the second aspect is looking at more passive policies where there is a sort of redistribution, such as providing money to the families, for example, an income transfer program, or negative income tax, where there is an external increase in the income of the family. And one important thing that I would like to stress here is that what the technology of skill formation allows to us is basically to break the analysis of an intervention in 2 steps. We all know the importance of having long-run outcomes in order to analyze the actual effect of an intervention over the life cycle. But do we actually need to wait until those long-run outcomes are realized in order to study them? Or is there a way such that we can do that even if the intervention is being proposed now and we want to analyze it at the end of the year, for example, or next year, but we really don't know what the effect at age 50 will be. And that's what a framework that attached the analysis of the intervention with the technology of skill formation allow it to do. Because if we know what is the mapping, this second arrow, between skills or between parental decisions, parental engagement or parental information, for example, and outcomes of the child in their lives, basically we know this arrow. So what we really need to understand is how participation in the program affects skills and affect parental engagement. And this we can do without waiting until the adult outcomes is realized. And the fact that we know this mapping through the analysis of the technology of skill formation allow us to get much more informative outcomes out of an intervention, even if these adult outcomes are not realized, if we know what the effect of the intervention is on aspects that mediate the effect of the program on the final outcome. So skills, parental responses, and etc. The main lessons that we get is, but something that Professor Ekman was mentioning before, it's true that IQ is affected, seems only in the very early intervention, but this doesn't mean that the interventions that don't affect IQ are ineffective. Actually, this simply means that it's important to measure more than just cognition or measures of IQ or abstract intelligence when we gather data from the intervention. The second aspect is that while there are effective adolescent intervention, they seem to be effective very often through an incapacitation effect. So you provide incentives to the child to stay in school, and this has an effect on the reduction on crime, which is good by itself, obviously, because people are in school instead of being on the street committing crime. But it's not necessarily clear if this is an effect because the propensity of committing crime is actually reduced, or because the people are incentivized to stay in a context in which they are incapacitated to commit crime. They are actually staying in school for that day. And the last thing that I was mentioning before, which is actually a novel finding, and we want to understand more how this works, is that it really seems that the interventions that are effective because they are able to change the whole path of investment. And this is consistent with this idea of dynamic complementarity. You want high early investment, but you also need to provide high late investments after you have had high early investment, because they are very productive, exactly because you had a good skill base. And how can you do that if you have an intervention that intervenes when the children is 2-3 years old? A way to increase the whole path of investment over the life cycle is to actually have an effect on the parents, because the parents will be the one that will be with you likely until you are at least 18 and will provide all those investments. So if the intervention indeed is effective in changing the skill base of the child, but not only that, it also changes parental information or parental engagement, then likely not only investment during those years in which the child is in the center will be changed, but investment over the whole life cycle of the child, at least until he's with his family, will be changed. And we need to understand better. We see, as you can see in this graph, which is a preliminary study that was done by Sean Moon in the group on the peri data, it seems to be that the treated, which are the red people, have an higher, the parents feel that their importance of parenting is higher in affecting child development for both girls and boys in the treatment group. But we need to understand more actually why is this happening. Is this a direct effect of the intervention? Is just that the parent is responding to a more curious child, a more interested child? That's something that one needs to understand, because if it's something that can be changed by designing the intervention, it's probably something that someone might want to change by designing the intervention, because it might be very cost effective to do so. The last aspect is the part on family income. So there are two claims on family income. The first one is the importance of family incomes for schooling outcomes, and the second is the importance of family income for family investments. So there is a recent literature that looks at and claims that there is an increase in credit in the financial constraints that students face when they enter into college. And this is one of the figures, actually those are two superimposed figures for this study from Belli and Lochner in 2007, where they use, this is really Lochner using NLSY 97 data and Lochner using NLSY 79 data. And this graph plots enrollment in college by ability, like the 4 blocks, and inside of the big blocks, the smaller bars, is by family income. So you see there is clearly a family income gradient, there is clearly an ability gradient, which is even more relevant than the family income one. And then what you see, the shaded, is the changes between looking at sample in the NLSY 79, so early 80s basically, and the NLSY 97, so late 90s. And what you observe is a general increase in attendance in school, but also you observe that there is a greater increase for the lower ability quartiles. And the increase in the lower ability quartiles is more concentrated in the higher income quartiles of the family. So people use this evidence to claim that this is showing that there are greater credit constraints because family income has become more important. The point is that you see that first, for more able students, it seems that these constraints are either not present or something must happening because you don't see that income gradient in the changes. And the second aspect is that other studies that actually look at what is family income tends to emphasize the fact that it really seems that education is an income elastic merit good for the parents. So actually is an incentive to the parents, even absent, we were seeing before the returns of making this choice, even absent great returns for the children to make this choice if he basically had to pay for it, the parents provide tied transfer, to the transfer that the child only gets if he goes to college, because it's actually in the utility of the parents as a paternalistic being in this case to incentivize the attendance of his child to college. And if this utility for the parents having a children education as a consumption good for them is income elastic, we might think many reasons why this might be the case. Among richer parents is more trendy with their peers to actually say that your child is in college rather than not so. Then we might observe a similar pattern even absent credit constraint. So what I'm trying to say is not that this figure denies or shows the presence of credit constraint, but that credit constraints is actually one and probably not the most likely story if we combine it with studies that look at parental, other form of parental transfers of what's happening in this case. The last aspect is the role of family income on family investments during the life cycle of the children. So there is evidence that the family income has a huge role once we look at the permanent income of the family. More richer family invest more in their children. The point is this a causal role or is just correlated with like parental education, parental abilities, or other unobserved factor that determines both parental income and investment in the children? In order to do so, one needs to distinguish the effect of income from other confounding effects, such as the effect of parental characteristics, but also need to distinguish a pure effect of income from effect of other changes, such as wage changes, which not only provide an income effect, but provide a substitution effect, where the effect might actually go through an increase in timing, for example, rather than being the actual changes in income that produces the change, but maybe you're just increasing the time that the parents spend with the children. And the last aspect is not only income by its levels that is important, but is it also the timing of income? If we think about the presence of these sensitive and critical periods, then you might think that there are moments in the development of the child where income is more important, in particular the early years, and even more specifically, one might think for each skill at certain periods in which it's crucial to have investments. And the investigation on the timing of income and on the role of income has been often done by looking at experiments where income is changed in different periods when the child has different ages. And we analyzed many of those studies. We were pointing to more, so we analyzed even more. And actually, I would say those are the general lessons that we get. The first one is that the studies in general seems to fail to actually isolate a pure income effect, and they confound very often income and substitution effects, which are interested as a general effect, but we might want to understand how much is due to change in labor supply and how much is due to the actual effect of income. The second aspect is that the current literature seems to kind of very often bump together numerous programs, some that work, some that don't work, and coming out with general estimates of these melting pot of different programs which kind of look the same. Actually, it seems that it would be more interesting in order to try, even in the programs that provide increased income to the families, to understand why do we observe those differences. There is a study, for example, that looks at numerous programs in different cities in the US and finds some strong effects in some location and not effects in the other, in programs that apparently look the same. So is it just a pure statistical fact that we happen to find something that is statistically significant just because we look at numerous experiments, or is it actually something of that program? It would be interesting to know, to analyze more in detail if it's something of that specific program that maybe does something that is indeed effective, and we would want to know that because that would be interesting. And the last aspect is that paper that, on which economists have a kind of a comparative advantage because we've studied those life cycle models with asset accumulation for a long time, that look at estimates of credit constraints, find a weak role of them, not because they aren't present. It actually seems that a large proportion of the population is credit constraints, but is not the population one might think of being credit constraints, such as the one that provides low investment. Very often are high-skilled parents that maybe don't achieve their optimal level of investment because they face a constraint, but they still are providing a very high level of investment. They would provide an even higher level of investment absent those credit constraints. In the study of Cockott and Lochner, for example, which is probably the one that does this analysis more prominently and with greater detail, 68% of college graduates in the sample appear to be credit constraints. So it's hard to think that 68% of college graduate parents don't provide enough to their children. It's possible that they would provide even more absent any financial constraint, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the type of the population on which we want to intervene. And indeed, when by simulating the model, etc., those credit constraints are removed, first, the effect of removing those constraints is usually dominated by other type of policies, with policies that target directly children or other type of simulation policies. And the second aspect is that in an intergenerational framework, in an overlapping generation model, it also seems that actually once generation, parents and children over time adjust to these newly designed, let's say, financial worlds in which we have weakened the financial constraints, actually the effect of releasing them disappear because families go back to a constrained position. So it not only seems a weak effect, but it also seems only something that is on the transition path. In the new steady state, the effect is no longer there. So to conclude, what we've learned from this study is what we should do more, and I think that's also something that probably this center will try to do, and hopefully will. The first thing is trying to have a deeper understanding of how family responds to investment, so how parents respond even to interventions that are not necessarily targeted to the parents. The second is try to go beyond the technology, not only in looking at the mechanism generating the investments, but also in trying to see, like right now, these technologies kind of as a passive child and parents dumping time and goods on him and mentors and teachers doing something similar. But what we might want to understand is how parents respond to children, how these interactions play on, how do parents actually incentivize the children itself to put effort in what he does, for example. So this aspect is these active child models or parent-child interaction models. The last aspect is, the last two aspects is the interaction of credit constraints and fertility or other life cycle decisions that actually add a margin of choice for the parents on what the parents can do with their children, not only how many investment to provide, but when to do so. And the last aspect is this aspect of fairness and efficiency across different children, not only in society as a whole, but in what happens inside the families in order to understand indeed how parents, there is some, Berman had some research on that in the 80s, for example. Do families behave efficiently given the technology, or they don't because maybe they don't have enough information or for other reasons? Thank you very much.